The first thing wrong was the cold. September in Afghanistan, and the air bit like February on a stateside range. Dogs had barked for 2 hours, then stopped like someone clapped a lid over the valley. Radios kept 1 bar of life and then flattened to breathless static, like the night was holding 2 fingers over the antenna and listening. We'd taken the empty village by the book. Mud brick houses around a well, alleys that promised ambush and delivered dust. 1 British squad, 1 of ours. I had the midnight to morning watch because sleep wasn't landing for anyone anyway. Private Nash swore he could see the ridge breathing. Sergeant Elie Calderon made a joke about British stew waking the dead. Mike Jordan, the Marine on loan, smoked and said the elders avoided our eyes because lies weigh 90 pounds and honest fear weighs more. The interpreter, Wali, told us the name of the wadi meant throat. He drew the letters in the dust with a boot heel, not touching the center of the circle. Old men tell boys not to whistle near the ridge, he said, and then pretended he hadn't said it. He pointed at the generator shack and at the bare bulb above the clinic door, both of which had begun to pulse like something was breathing through copper. Don't fix, he said. Let it be sick. At 0200 the ridge grew a person. It didn't walk up. It didn't climb. One frame it was rock, the next, a figure too tall and too thin, night pressed into the weave of robes that ate our spotlight like dry earth swallowing water. Rangefinder shaved meters off it while it never moved. 700. 600. 580. We watched it from 3 positions and got 3 identical angles that refused to agree on distance. Unknown individual, I called in Dari. Identify yourself. The wind made a decision and went the other way. No answer. Nash and Gibson went up by the book. Leapfrog, cover, breathe, check. 50 meters from the outcrop they reported nothing but old goat prints and a candy wrapper flattened to silver. Then the figure was back in our scopes, same position, same tilt of the head like a child listening for a parent's step. Nash said, "It's right here," from empty rock. Gibson said, "We were just there," from rock that didn't remember them. We pulled them back and counted helmets. Counted magazines. Counted our breaths because numbers were a rope and the night was a well. I realized somewhere between 50 and 47 that I'd started naming items on the table at the command post, map, radio, cup, pen, so the room would pick a reality and keep it. The first night ended without the figure crossing the boundary of what we believed was ours. At 0430 the cold withdrew like a cat deciding not to test claws on a curtain. The bulb above the clinic steadied. The generator coughed twice and settled on 1 note. The dogs barked again, 3 sharp acknowledgments and a long insult. A shepherd came up the track at sunrise with his hands held out as if we had a gun on him we hadn't bothered to raise. He said the well water tasted like pennies. We told him to stay in his house, then secured a village that had no one in it by telling an old man where it was safe to stand. The second night, Wally stayed beside me. "If you hear 2 clicks," he said, "do not move." I told him that wasn't in the manual. He said the manual didn't know this valley. "It is older than words," he said. It learned rules before there were men to break them. At 2130 the ridge stopped pretending. It lit with soft blue as if the stone was full of plankton and somebody kicked the reef. Hundreds of figures shoulder to shoulder along the skyline. Some looked human at rifle distance until you tried to make a face out of it and the edges slid. One was dog-shaped if dogs had too many joints and an extra hinge in the jaw. One had the proportions of a Challenger tank and moved like it had been taught to be flesh. A few were nothing you could give a name to without borrowing from geometry. Do not spotlight, I said. Jordan was already bringing illumination up because Marines do not like guessing. The magnesium burst turned the world into a surgeon's light. The beam struck the nearest figure and passed through in places, casting a shadow that fell sideways. Boyd on the British rifle said, "Negative thermal, temps falling." She gave me numbers that belonged on a mountain in January, not a high desert with the moon fat over it. Her voice had the calm of someone reporting rain, and that calm kept the rest of us from doing something dumber than fear. Hold fire unless you've got effect, I said, but the effect we had was fear and tracers. We opened anyway when the line flowed down the slope without walking. The square pulsed with muzzle flash, brass clattered, a mother of pearl of spent casings underfoot. Tracers stitched the nearest shape and sank as if we'd fired into a pond. The dog thing accelerated in a spill of mercury and landed in Green's fighting hole. Its mouth unhinged with the heavy grace of a trapdoor, and the boy we played spades with the night before came apart not in meat but in geometry. Blocks. Puzzles. A diagram being undrawn. Blue mist rose and the thing breathed it like steam. Back. I shouted, and the word felt like it had to shove its way through syrup to reach anyone. Ellie dragged Green's vest and got the straps and nothing of him. Gibson threw a flashbang that went off with the sound of wet paper tearing. The flare over our heads guttered and came back twice as bright, like it had learned from failing. We don't win nights like that. We survive them if something old remembers us kindly. The old came on 2 legs and a staff. He stepped out of the mosque doorway moving perpendicular to the blue, as if tides and gravity did not apply. Hood back, cataract eyes that still tracked, lines in his cheeks like dry riverbeds. He raised the staff and symbols cut into it woke with a gold that wasn't any kind of light I'd seen, not chemical, not electricity. The nearest figure wavered like heat above a road. He drew with the staff and the drawing stayed in the air, strokes of fire on dark. "I am Shafi," he said in English sanded by time. "Keeper. Your guns are useless. Your circle may hold." "What are they?" I asked, doing the thing I always do in fights, making my voice even so the green ones wouldn't hear the edges. "Forms of an old hunger. It wakes, it feeds, it sleeps." He poured a handful of grains into my palm. Salt that glowed from inside. Bone ground to powder. Herb that smelled like dried sun. "Circle," he said. We circled. Not pretty. Not perfect. We traced the line around our people and our dead boy's empty hole. When the dog thing struck it bucked like it hit an invisible wall and reassembled 3 yards away with less confidence in its joints. The herd on the ridge paused as if listening for a new instruction. Wally spoke to Shafi without looking at him, as if looking would make the protection smaller. "How long does a circle last?" he asked. "As long as it is believed," Shafi said. "And as long as the hand that drew it keeps blood warm." Shafi cut his palm and the staff's symbols drank the blood and burned brighter. The barrier stepped outward a pace, then another. We moved with it, a bubble of gold in a sea of blue. I asked how long. He said, "Long enough to leave," and his breath shortened like each word cost a step. "Do not record the lights," he said when Ellie raised a camera. "They use mirrors better than you. Do not correct the flicker," he added when one of the Brits kicked a flood to aim it higher. The bulb sighed. The circle shuddered. I said the rule out loud because speaking a rule makes it more true. We fell back by bounds toward the Humvees. Radios muttered dead languages through white noise and then went honest dead. The blue line flowed to keep pace with us, shepherding the herd it wanted, us, toward the places it liked to feed. Twice on the way I heard a relay double-click from nowhere and all the small hairs on my forearm stood up together. We stopped each time, because valley rules are like snakes, you step where you have already stepped and live, or you step new and learn. At the vehicles he made a smaller circle, mended it with a handful from his pouch and a murmur that pulled the hair on my arms toward his mouth. "Leave," he said. "Before dawn. It learns." "It learns?" Jordan asked, because men who fight for a living want the enemy to be stone or logic, not appetite and improvement. "It is hungry thing," Shafi said. "Hunger learns." He tucked something into my palm, carved bone on a thin cord, symbols cut so tight the grooves felt like skin, not carving. "Where?" he said. "There are echoes." We drove with nobody talking, headlights off because light lied. Behind us the valley breathed blue that grew brighter like a TV left on in a room where nobody admits to sleeping. The road up out of the bowl had a switchback where goats like to test your axle, tonight it felt like a throat. The circle around the trucks buzzed like high wire. On the last rise the gold thinned. The blue pressed close enough to show faces I knew wearing smiles that didn't quite fit. I kept my eyes on the hood line and the white paint of the shoulder and the bone charm in my fist. Wally whispered the names of his children like a rope, and the valley let us go because we did not look back. At the forward base they asked for a story the army could afford. We gave them one with acronyms, not ghosts, IED. EM interference. Chemical agent. Green gone in a blast we couldn't recover because of secondary detonation. They stamped it with a bronze rectangle, folded it into a manila envelope, and put a flag on a coffin that weighed less than it should have. That is the work too, some nights. Tell the lie after you told the truth to the handful who have to carry it. Make it simple enough to sign. Gibson started to hear voices with consonants you had to bleed for. She would begin to repeat them and the little vessels in her nose would concede and let go. The medic said PTSD like he was swabbing a scrape. Boyd tracked the ridge with the flat look of a sniper who can hit everything that matters and knows this is not that. Nash told me the dreams were different from other deployment dreams because these made him count his fingers in the morning and he always had one too many for a second. Ellie painted the symbols she remembered and the paint dried with a dull shine that made my jaw ache if I stared too long. Shafi didn't come back to the base. Of course he didn't. He has a valley and a ledger that runs in centuries. He laid markers while we watched through shakier hands than we aimed with, bone and salt bundles buried at the corners of the world nobody maps. He bled on them and the ground drank and glowed dull and went quiet. 7 days, he said. Then sleep. Until it wakes again. We sent a small team with him the next dusk because you can't just let a man walk into a ledger alone. Wally went because he'd been born 2 valleys over and owed this place a grandfather. Ellie went because she didn't like the way the generator lights learned her footprint in the dust. I went because I keep saying yes to the version of me that believes we can pay a debt in the same currency it was written. The markers were not dramatic. They were ordinary places under moonlight given the job of being corners, the mouth of a dry culvert, a flat rock with a crack that looked like a map of a country none of us had visited, the knee of an irrigation ditch that would run again when the snows gave up a little. At each point Shafi drew a shape that wasn't a circle and wasn't a square, a boundary that kept changing while remaining itself. The staff drank blood in shivers, not in streams. The blue on the ridge watched like the reflection of a fire on a distant window. Do not speak the word for them, Shafi said when Wali asked a question that wanted a name. We do not invite a guest by carving the shape of his chair. The generator at the clinic hiccuped and the bulb went out and then in again and stayed dimmer, like someone had taught it a better way to conserve itself. Wali wrote a note in the medic's ledger in Pashto and then translated it into the kind of English you use with men who will be rotated out before the snow. Do not fix the flicker. Do not use phones to look. Do not stand in the throat after midnight if the dogs are not barking. Sleep in corners made crooked. On the 7th day the cold arrived early and the dogs did not. The well water tasted like pennies again. We were on the edge of the village laying a field phone line that had no need to exist until the radio learned to be a mirror, when the relay in the ceiling of the schoolhouse clicked twice. Everyone with their shoulders squared to work stopped with 2 nails halfway in and a line looped around 2 rocks. We didn't move. A length of wire fell in a slow rush where Ellie's feet would have been and thrashed like a snake without a plan. The second hand on my watch jerked and refused to be elastic. After 60 counts that might have been 51 or 65, the world pretended to be one again. Shafi came at dusk with a bowl and a warning. It sleeps, he said, but it listens. When it wakes again, it will know more. You must teach your replacements the rules you did not have to learn and pray they believe before belief is bought for them. He told a story when the night got interested, about a caravan that crossed this way when Roman coins were the best argument you could make. The men brought torches, and the ridge lit blue. They left their goods as a circle, not to feed the hunger but to distract it while they stepped sideways into morning. The story ended with a list of names that were not quite like any names we had, and then the little names of the goats that came back to drink at a river that had not washed the blood. We rotated out. The ledger does not rotate with you. It keeps the same page and waits for your next line. Stateside is a thing men say like it's a country where weather is sane and nights do not require negotiations. In San Diego I found out my apartment had its own hills and valleys. My kitchen window reflected a man with a bone charm under a shirt that stiffened with salt. The fluorescent above the stove hummed a note too high and my jaw hurt if I stood under it. At 3:17 the radio in the living room decided to be awake and breathed a thin band of snow that knew my sister's voice enough to say my name and ask me to open the door. I named objects until the room agreed, table, chair, lamp, and the bone warmed and the hum settled back down like a sheet you tuck under a mattress. Ellie called and didn't say hello. Do not fix the flicker, she said, like she had seen me reach for the bulb. We breathed together for 60 and then hung up like we'd done something. Months later in a library with the smell of dust and damp staplers, I found accounts that bend toward what we saw. Monks chalking boundaries to keep a crypt quiet. A legion disappearing in a forest that authors blame on ambush though the notes in the margins mention lights. Old women marking doors with salt when men who wrote the official book were at war and couldn't tell them not to. A code of herbs and bone whispered from Anatolia to Guatemala under names that change but the rules rhyme. I copied phrases by hand because printers failed on the pages with diagrams and wrote lines I could not later remember writing. Jordan sent an email with a scan of something hammered in Latin but telling a story too close to ours. Boyd texted me coordinates of EM spikes that didn't belong to the weather. Gibson mailed a painting without a return address, bright colors like stained glass, and somewhere behind them a blue that changed shades depending on where you set the canvas in your room. If you leaned it against the wall at an angle, sleep came easier. If you hung it straight, knives felt heavier in your hand. Wally wrote once. The words were careful like a man walking a path that had not been swept. He said Shafi had been a boy during the last waking. He said the old men did not die the way men die in the city, they wore their names longer until the next person could carry them. He said the well no longer tasted like pennies except when the wind came wrong, and then all food tasted of metal. He said a child counted to 60 when the relay double-clicked in the schoolhouse and the child's mother did not move even to pick up the cup she had dropped. I taught a class I wasn't paid to teach to men who were going somewhere different with similar problems: how to count without looking at a watch, how to keep the radio at 2, how to keep your hand off the glass. I wrote a card because the army loves cards: do not correct the flicker. Do not spotlight the ridge. Do not record the lights. Count by touch when comms desync. Leave when the ward weakens. I pretended it was procedure, not prayer. Years moved. The ledger didn't. I took a trip I didn't tell anyone about to a salt flat where the map said a lake had once made promises and left. The desert air had that expensive stillness you can't buy in a city. On the white crust someone had cut a circle too perfect for a man with a shovel and too imperfect for a surveyor. Traffic cones ringed it like sincerity. A technician in a hard hat stood with his fingers out, the human impulse to touch the thing, to see if it is cold or if your skin will report something that will make your mouth honest. In the far corner a green generator had a stencil I recognized: do not correct the flicker. A gust lifted grit and wrote lines in the dust that looked like the channels on Shafi's staff. I left before the second click, or maybe the second click left before me. The letter that came next had a stamp from a country that had changed its name since I was there. Inside, a photograph: the ridge, blue like a bruise under skin. Men in new uniforms holding old ideas. A boy standing outside the circle with a hand on the boundary as if it were a fence you could climb. On the back, Wally's careful script: the cycle counts to itself. Maybe not 100. I went back because a kind of man always goes back when a ledger calls his name. Ruiz wasn't there to give me a card with orders, but the rules travel without signatures. I flew on a plane that pretended it was old enough to complain and drove a truck that had opinions about sand. The village was smaller. The well had a new lip. The clinic had 2 bulbs now. The dogs barked and then didn't. The generator learned to apologize with its whole frame instead of its voice. Shafi still stood like the center of a compass that never pointed true north because no one had asked it to. His hair had gone from white to paper, more noise than line. He took my hand like he was finishing a sentence we started in another language. "It remembers you," he said without hello. "It remembers many of you. The hunger does not keep photographs. It keeps angles." We walked the corners, old markers gone dull and ready for the next set of palms to convince them. He bled into the dirt and the dirt said thank you the way dry places do when they are given something to drink. I carried the bowl and the herb and the bone warmed like it remembered my hand. We weren't the only ones this time. Men from another valley came with their own keeper, a woman whose staff was not carved but wrapped in wires that hummed when she spoke. Her rules were the same words dressed differently. Don't speak to mirrors after 3:17. Don't drop to 0. Don't widen a doorway that doesn't want to be a door. She looked at Shafi like a daughter looks at a father she won't outlive. He looked at her like a map looks at a road a new hand drew. We lost a boy on the second night anyway because rules are rope but boys are water. He climbed a low wall to see if the blue was closer from up there. The blue was the same distance from everywhere. It reached in the way a wave doesn't decide to reach, it just does. The boy came apart like green had, and the part that screamed was a sound I have only heard when a metal sheet is dragged in dust and the dust remembers being wet. His mother didn't move when the relay double-clicked. She waited 60 and then picked up what could be picked up. Grief has rules too. They aren't written because that would make them invitations. The Ridge tried something new on the third night, because Shafi had said the hunger learns. It mirrored our circle back at us in blue, a joke with teeth. The blue boundary wobbled when we breathed in and out, as if it were listening for a rhythm. The woman with the wire-wrapped staff turned her palm and the wires sang and the gold steadied, and I understood that the rules travel, but the instruments change. We left before dawn again because leaving is one of the few victories that stays won. Wally stood by the road and waved like men wave at trains, half goodbye, half yes, half no. He gave me a photograph of his children at a school desk with a crooked corner so the mirror in the glass would fail to calibrate. He said, "Teach them away," and meant the boys who would replace me, not his children, and a thing I am proud of is that I knew which he meant. Stateside again. This time, the radio waited until 3:17 to breathe. The bone charm learned my thermostat schedule. The fluorescent at work flickered and I didn't fix it, and the office learned that the coffee tasted better when we let small broken things stay politely broken. I put the card with the rules on a bulletin board where men who liked procedure would learn to like ritual. A young sergeant from somewhere with maples wrote the rules on the back of his hand. He came back from a different desert and underlined the word leave. He added before dawn in his own ink. Men improve manuals when they live. I could tell you the tidy ending you want, where ceremonies teach the valley to be the kind of place tourists can point a camera at without the camera breathing back through the lens. I can't. The valley is still itself. The ridge still wears blue when it wants to. The ledger still wants lines. The best thing we did was make a language for what to do when a relay clicks twice and your own name sounds like a door. Sometimes the radio at home clicks twice in a quiet room and I stop moving and count to 60 with my eyes not on any mirror. Sometimes the dog across the street stares at the hill 30 minutes before the news says a small earthquake happened in a county that doesn't have earthquakes. Sometimes a news photo shows a circle cut into salt and the cones around it mean scientists, and the intern holding the floodlight is trying to aim it better and all I want is to knock the lamp from his hand. In a drawer I keep the card from the base with the stamped rectangles and the words we signed. Under it I keep a copy we did not file, a hand map that shows how to draw a boundary that isn't a circle and still works. The paper smells faintly of copper when it rains, like the well did, and the bone warms through the shirt without a polite excuse. One morning, too early for anyone's day, I wake before the radio does. The window is a mirror if you allow it. I don't. I name the shoes by the door, the cup on the table, the lamp that hums, the bone that warms. In the next apartment someone drops a pan and apologizes to it, and I take that as a good omen in a world that rarely offers any you can afford. When the relay clicks twice in the ceiling of the room where I keep busy work and pretend not to wait, I don't move for 60 seconds. The cold comes through the vent wrong and leaves the same way. The lights breathe. The radio keeps itself politely at 2. The bone charm warms. I call the names of ordinary things until the ordinary wins again, and for now, that is survival. Wally said you can tell when a valley is about to remember something because children start miscounting stairs. We watched the schoolhouse. We fixed nothing. The bulb in the hallway chose its own rhythm and we let it keep time. That night a boy named Hamid stood in the doorway with a wooden ruler, not crossing the threshold. He tapped wood to stone, 1, 2, and then stopped like the next number had gone somewhere else to be used. His mother thanked the air behind him. She did not look at the glass of the case where textbooks slept. On the fourth evening the woman with the wire-wrapped staff joined us on the roof of the clinic. Her name was Layla. Up close the wires were not copper, they were something darker with a soft sheen like hair underwater. "They carry breath," she said, touching one strand with a finger that had a scar like a crescent. "Not mine. Not yours. Something that remembers both." She lifted her staff and the wires chimed without touching. The blue along the ridge adjusted as if a hand on a violin string had leaned a little. "It learns faster when we try to teach it not to," Ellie said. Layla nodded without looking away from the ridge. "So we choreograph," she said. "We step where we already stepped and tell the floor that rhythm is a kind of fence." That was the night we made crooked corners on purpose. We dragged cabinets until the room shapes broke their clean 90 and settled into angles that argued. We taped paper over glass and then tore the paper, so a reflection would have to choose which edge to believe. Wally joked that we had become bad architects. Shafi said the valley preferred bad architecture, it slipped on it like ice. There was a small room behind the clinic where a refrigerator had hummed an honest C for a decade and then retired. I sat in there with the bone charm in my fist and an AM radio tuned between stations. At 3:17 the snow breathed the way a sleeping animal remembers it has lungs. A woman's voice under the static said my name in a way that made the space between my ribs a door. I named the chair, the shelf, the plate with the chip, the radio with a crack along the dial. The door remembered to be wood again. The voice asked for the window. I said the window didn't live here. I let the fridge stay unplugged. The next afternoon a man with a camera and the belief that he was doing a good thing arrived in a white Land Cruiser with plates that said he owned an abbreviation. He wanted an interview. Layla told him he was already standing in a story and that was the only kind that eats men alive. "Please," he said in a voice that had learned to get through gates, "people need to see." She asked, "See what?" He looked at the ridge and smiled the way you smile when you think a mountain will pose for you if you are earnest enough. Layla used one finger to push the lens cap on. "We don't record what asks to be a picture," she said. "We let it be someone else's problem in 100 years." The man left 3 bottles of water as if this were payment and drove away badly, the way men drive when a place refuses to fit in a photograph. In the nights that followed we learned the lesser rules. Don't sing, even under your breath, the valley takes it as permission to harmonize. Don't write names in dust, dust is a thin mirror. Don't stand in a doorway when you count, you'll lose your place to the wood. When you hear the double click from no machine you know, think your numbers in your own head, not the valley's. Don't try to teach the dogs not to bark, their failing to is how you know to listen harder. Back home the echoes found work. My neighbor's baby monitor learned to count before the baby could. At 3:17 it woke to static and rattled the crib with a pattern like rain rehearsing. The child pointed at the corner and practiced a word that didn't exist. I knocked and spoke to the mother like I was talking to an engine that was stalling. "Don't move when it clicks twice," I said, "and if the light flickers, let it." She looked at me the way you look at a person who might be selling you a religion. "And if it says your name?" she asked. "Name the room," I said. "Name what the room owns until it remembers." A week later she left a pie on my step with a note, "It remembered." The VA psychiatrist had kind eyes that didn't flinch and a clock that didn't move when I checked it. She asked about sleep. I told her the truth that fits on forms and kept the truths that live behind glass. Sometimes the brain persuades itself that rituals make it safe, she said. Sometimes they do, I said. We agreed that we preferred rooms that did not argue. She wrote down something with the letter O a lot. On my way out, the fluorescent in the hallway hummed a high note, and she said over her shoulder without looking, "Please don't fix that." We built a class at Pendleton in a storage bay with painted lines that lied about basketball. It wasn't a class the army would staple to the front of a binder, but men came because rumor had done our advertising. We taught how to draw boundaries that aren't circles. We taught the 60 count 2 ways, out loud for kids and in your head for rooms that eavesdrop. We taught how to carry a radio like a live thing that needs to stay at 2. We taught that mirrors after 3:17 are a conversation you don't want to have sober. We didn't call any of it superstition. We called it fieldcraft and made the room nod. Men are good at learning if you make it the same shape as something they already respect. Emails stacked, a French unit that saw lights in a Pyrenean tarn and watched ropes grow wet without water, a Peruvian mining village with a chalk line on every threshold and a goat that refused to cross any of them, a coastal station in Japan where the bulb over the radio breathed with the tide. The Roman entry Jordan found mentioned a centurion forbidding the polishing of shields after the 3rd hour, a detail so petty and precise none of us laughed. The pattern of hundreds wobbled. Some counts were 87 years. Some were 62. Layla said hunger counts by what it eats, not by calendars. It learns faster in cities. Once we tested the boundary at a stateside range because men who teach like to see a thing fail where they can afford it. We marked a shape with salt on concrete, gave the room one broken corner, and turned on 5 different lamps that weren't built to agree. At 3:17 the hum rose and a paper cup in the center drifted an inch and then settled back like a breath. A corporal reached out to steady it. "Don't," I said, too late for grace. He didn't touch the cup, but the place where his fingers would have touched learned the shape of his hand. For a week he said knives felt louder. Then it went away, or he learned to be polite to it, which is another way of saying the same thing. Wally wrote again. His daughter drew the ridge in blue crayon on a piece of brown paper torn from a shop bag. The ridge had eyes, and under it she drew small gold circles with men in them like seeds. On the back Wally had printed the rules in English in letters like pebbles: do not look at the glass after 03:17. Do not make perfect corners. Do not write names. He asked if the 100 could shorten if the world learned to carry cameras the way it carries hands. I answered with a story about a salt flat and a man with a floodlight who meant well. I wrote, "We do not fix the flicker." The second return to the valley wasn't because the ledger called, it was because a map I trusted less than I should have showed a new road cut across the throat. Progress has its own rituals, survey stakes, string, numbers that promise the land will stay still if you pin it with enough math. We stood where the graders had paused and looked at a ditch that would be a culvert when engineers convinced funding to believe. "They will put glass here," Layla said, with a camera and a light and a story to sell. She set her staff in the dust and the wires hummed a chord that made the hair on my arms lift in a polite line. Shafi stood with his hand on a stake and asked it to be a tree. The stake considered, then agreed for an evening. We taught the foreman to count to 60 and to leave when the gold grew thin. He taught us that the schedule didn't include mercy. Schedules rarely do. That night the hunger tried a different joke. It brought the blue down not as a wall but as an audience. It stood at the edge of our gold and waited like theater. Faces assembled and then disassembled, like clay that had been told how a face should be and preferred the freedom of smudge. The dog thing sat, panting steam in negative, as if patience had a jaw. We did not perform. We spoke names of objects to ourselves and kept the radio at 2. The blue learned nothing from us because we offered nothing. That is also a rule. Back home again, I stopped a kid from a film program from aiming a drone at a valley in the desert because his professor needed liminal shots. I said the word liminal back to him the way you say, fire, in a kitchen where a towel has met a flame and is in denial. He said he'd fly high. I said he'd be recording a mirror with a mirror while holding a mirror between his teeth. He said he didn't understand. I said that was good. He went to the coast to photograph waves that had the decency to be themselves. There is a drawer in my place with two things, the stamped rectangles of what we told the army and the handwritten shape of what we do. I add to the second sometimes, not with new rules but with reminders for rooms. Small broken things are allies. Corners can be persuaded. Names belong to the living. I keep the bone charm with it. It warms when weather pretends to be a pattern and then remembers it is only air. One dawn I found Layla's staff leaned against my porch rail, the wires still humming a syllable that sounded like my name viewed from an angle. There was no note, only a scrap of cloth tied near the grip with a chalky smear on it. The smear was the exact color of the gold we'd carried in a bowl. I brought the staff inside and set it in a corner that wasn't. The room approved. The last time I saw Shafi we were both too tired for dramatic exits. He sat with his back to the mosque's cool wall and watched the ridge forget to be hungry for a week. It will come earlier, he said. Cities bring plates. He smiled with half his mouth and tapped the staff with his nails. But we teach our children to put their cups down well. He meant we make rules into habits and let habit be a fence. He named the hunger with a word I cannot keep in my mouth without metal. He said it asked for a story every 100 years and sometimes it was generous about what counted as a story. He said once the valley fed its songs and the blue receded like a tide that had remembered an appointment. He said once a king gave it a bridge and it carried the bridge into a fold in the air and set it down again upside down to teach men to draw better. I asked him why salt, why bone, why herb. He said salt because water remembers where it has been and salt is a way to explain the boundary to it. Bone because it carries the idea of shape even after the animal decides to be dirt. Herb because living remembers how to say no softly. Blood because debt's like a signature. He said glass is dangerous because it wants to be a window and a mouth. When I left, Layla handed me a coil of wire like a bracelet. It carries breath, she said. Not mine. Not yours. Something that remembers both. At home I wrapped it around the base of a lamp that flickered and let it flicker and the room forgave the lamp and then forgot to be angry at the dark. We approached the years men like to round to. Journalists will want dates, hunger will want angles. I make kits, a card with the rules and letters big enough for panic to read, a coil of wire, a bag of salt, an herb that can pretend to be any of three if you ask it, and a little bone carved with grooves tight as skin. I hand them to men and women who might be the ones who get the call at 1:58. I tell them the story without the parts that try to make a theater of it. I tell them what to do. I tell them what not to do. I tell them what to do when they do what they were told not to do because people are people. On a morning with weather that wore the wrong coat, the radio clicked twice and I didn't move. A car down the street coughed and died and then remembered. The light over the sink hummed and the hum felt like the throat of a bridge. The bone warmed. The staff in the corner chimed. I named the table, the chair, the lamp, the floor, the wall, the door, my breath. The ordinary one again with the weary grace of a veteran showing up to a small-town parade. I don't promise victory to the kids I teach. I promise instruction. I say, when it clicks twice, don't move. When the light flickers, let it. When the radio asks, keep it at 2. Don't look into glass after 3:17. Don't fix right angles if you can help it. Draw the boundary that isn't a circle. Salt, bone, herb, breath. Leave when the gold grows thin. Bury your pride with the empty brass. Tell a simpler story on the paperwork. Keep the true one where rooms can reach for it and steady themselves. Sometimes at night, if I lean the painting Gibson scent so it argues with the wall, the room sleeps easier. Sometimes in the morning the bone is still warm. Sometimes the staff hums the syllable that is my name from a safe distance. Sometimes the radio between stations is only weather. Those are good days. And sometimes the valley sends a postcard in the shape of cold in September, and I know that somewhere a boy is counting to 60 and using the names of the objects he can see to keep the door closed. If he calls a number wrong, the room will correct him. If he remembers the rules will remember him. This is not a happy ending. It is an ending that has learned how to go on. If you love chilling horror stories and eerie mysteries, you're in the right place. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and join us every week for a new descent into darkness. Your next nightmare is just one click away.